Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth and final Creative Pack seminar of this academic year. We are a Policy and Evidence Centre. We are funded by the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we are based at Newcastle University, working in partnership with the Royal Society of Arts in London. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the seminar today, Professor Valentina Montalto. Valentina is Associate Professor of Cultural Policies and Economics at Kedge Business School in Paris. Her research lies at the intersection of urban geography, cultural economics, and social statistics. She has vast experience of over 15 years working internationally, leading the Cultural and Creative Cities Monitor at the European Commission's Joint Research Centre, advising on UNESCO's Culture 2030 indicators, and managing research projects at KEA, a Brussels-based policy firm. Her research on creative cities, culture and creative sectors measurement, and culture's contribution to sustainable development is published in numerous international peer-reviewed journals. On to today's seminar. Tourism is a major driver of economic activity in cities worldwide, but it has also grown very rapidly, bringing environmental strain and social tensions to host destinations and communities. As a response to these tensions, many countries and cities, including in Italy, have introduced tourist taxes designed to offset some of the costs and improve local welfare. In Italy, since 2011, Italian municipalities have had the power to levy a tourist tax, with revenues earmarked for tourism and heritage spending. Of course, then the question is, does this actually happen? Do these revenues genuinely allow a virtuous cycle, strengthening local cultural provision, or do they mainly get funneled back into other sectors like tourism? Without any further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Valentina Montalto. Valentina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giorgio, and thank you so much to Creative Pack for your kind invitation. So the topics of today's lecture, talk, is broadly speaking something that is very, very close to my art and to my research interest, as you briefly introduced, and has to do with how cities of any kind support culture and cultural heritage intended as a major component of the local economies and the residents' welfare. Probably a quite timely topic considering shrinking budgets for culture and rising costs. It's a topic that more specifically deals with this work with a specific kind of fund that they may or may not actually support culture. That is the revenues coming from tourist taxes. And it's a work that I'm currently developing together with Chiara Delle Nogare. As you said, there is extensive work on tourism economics also and municipal spending. Just to clarify, before I go ahead, as this is the main topic of today. So what is a tourist tax? It's a ad valorem or unit tax on overnight stays that can be found in the literature also with other names, actually, such as accommodation tax or lodging tax, bed tax, or hotel tax. So some of you may wonder what has all this to do with the field of cultural economics, so why this is relevant for cultural economists. Well, as you know, or as everybody knows very well, so tourism is certainly a major source of revenues for cities, but at the same time is bringing additional costs by bringing pressure on cultural and natural heritage, but also social tension on the host communities. And to internalize these externalities, many countries are answering by introducing tourist taxes that brings revenues that municipalities may want to use to differently support local public goods, among which possibly also cultural heritage that in many circumstances feature a public good characteristics. So the main open question that we wanted to deal with is indeed whether this is the case or actually not. There are at least three main reasons why we think that this topic is far from being trivial. First of all, in terms of revenues collected. So economically speaking, the revenues that come through the tourist tax are quite significant and actually keep rising. So in Italy specifically, where we will focus on with our empirical analysis, the total tourist tax revenue grew from approximately 60 million euros when the tax was reintroduced in 2011 to up about 1 billion euros recently in 2025, which makes the allocation of these revenues economically and policy relevant. We also noticed when we carried out our literature review on this topic that on the one hand, the topic of tourist tax is quite well covered in economic literature, in the tourism literature, but at the same time, there is an important gap. Why? Because the literature does study the tourist tax, but basically mainly by asking what is the effect on tourism demand. But there is virtually nothing of very, very little, very scattered, fragmented evidence on how these tourist tax revenues are actually used. And sometimes it's rather the reverse, the relationship that is studied. For instance, a paper from 2006 finds that when the tourist tax spending in the arts, cultural and tourism events does correlate positively with tourism growth. And last but not least, there may be interesting behaviorally implication. Indeed, a few papers find that the way this tourist tax revenues is used may have implications on acceptability and willingness to pay for this tax. For instance, Rotaris found in Trieste, so again in Italy, that willingness to pay is higher when these revenues target maintenance of parks, green areas, natural heritage, and cultural heritage as well as tourism services. So these considerations, so the economic importance, significance of these revenues, the literature gap, and the possibly behavior consequences lead us to our main research questions. So how do municipalities actually spend tourist tax revenues? And more specifically, do these additional revenues translate into greater spending in cultural goods, or are they primarily directed towards tourism-related expenditure? To answer this question, we are going to explore the staggered adoption of the tourist tax, try to understand what is the causal impact of this introduction on specific categories of municipal spending. To show you how we empirically treated this question, I'm going to guide you through these main subtopics. So first, I'm going to give you some more information about the law itself that reintroduced the Italian tourist tax. Then I'm going to tell you a bit more about the data used and our empirical approach, the results from our econometric analysis, and then I will go to some discussion and concluding remarks. So starting with the law, so as I was briefly mentioning, the tourist tax was reintroduced after 2 decades of stop, because something similar was actually in place before with a legislative decree that was adopted in 2011, which suggests some possible uses of this tax, but without strictly earmarking. So the law refers to possible uses for tourism infrastructure, heritage maintenance, as well as environmental protection, and what is called connected local public services. Given this framework, then mostly the law establishes that the taxes can be locally governed, so it's mostly also the municipalities that actually decide what to do then with this tax. There is still a cap per night for 5-star hotels, and importantly, the law also establishes eligibility criteria. So not all municipalities can actually introduce the tax, but only provincial capitals, except not Rome. Not that Rome cannot introduce the tax, but Rome actually has introduced the tax, as many of you probably have personally experienced, through a specific ad hoc provincial law, which explains why, for instance, Rome is out of our empirical analysis. Unions of municipalities are also eligible, as well as places declared tourist or heritage sites by their region. Actually, this recognition is quite tricky in the sense that ideally, and it was actually foreseen, that the Ministry of Tourism would have would have pulled all these lists compiled by regions to prepare a full list of eligible municipalities declared as tourist or heritage sites. But these lists are actually currently quickly changing and needs constant updates, which in the end basically resulted in a lack of such lists by the national government, which of course the lack of this list of eligible municipalities does have consequences also for our empirical analysis. But I will show how we implemented a number of careful steps so to make sure we have a proper and sound list of counterfactual municipalities for our empirical analysis. When it comes to adoption, as we can very clearly see from this graph, the adoption is generally staggered. So cohorts enter across the whole 2012-2024 window with two peak points in time. The first one in basically the year after the adoption in 2012, as probably expected. And the second actually peak point can be very easily explained. Why? Because what happened is that in 2015, there was a ban. So basically, municipalities were blocked from introducing new local taxes, and this ban was then abolished in 2017. So basically, the adoption of local taxes, among which the local tourist tax was basically restored, with the municipalities starting to adopt again the tax from 2018 on. Money speaking, apart from the total revenues collected, in per capita terms, as we can see from this graph, the mean revenue important rise from about 16 euros per resident at the beginning of the window under observation to roughly 45 euros per capita in 2024. Of course, with an important dip during the COVID years, but also nice recovery already from 2022. These are average values, and we can immediately see that if we actually compare this with the median values, we keep, let's say, the growing positive growing trend, but the figures actually might quite lower, going from 6 euros per resident up to 10 euros approximately per resident by the end of the period under observation. So data on the tax revenues come from an administrative dataset, so-called COP, managed by the Ministry of Economy and Finance, which records actual cash inflows by municipality, and here actually months, and then we aggregated them by year with a nice time coverage, while data on expenditure comes from a commercial dataset compiled by Bureau van Dijk. This dataset contained spending data measured as commitments. One important thing to know is that since 2015, all municipalities in Italy are required to adopt basically to report their spending according to a new reform, so according to new rules, according to which the expenditure are recorded by so-called mission. And for a specific research question, there are two missions that are particularly relevant. One is mission 5, that records spending for culture and heritage, and the second one is mission 7, that records tourism-related expenditure. As I was saying, there might be other spending categories that might be relevant for analysis, for instance, on the environment. What happens is that due to this reform, there is a break in the time series. Luckily enough, for some missions, notably culture and tourism, this time series actually have been harmonized. So we have a full comparable time series for culture and tourism, but this is actually not true for, at least for the time being, as far as we know, for other expenditure categories, notably environment. In order to study the causal effect of the tax introduction, we built our treatment and control groups. So one important thing to note is, and you might have noticed that actually when I presented the statistics on the adoption timelines, actually the total, if you were attentive enough, of the municipalities that adopted the taxes was actually lower than 1,600. And this is why the adoption timeline was calculated only on the number of municipalities that finally entered the empirical analysis. So why actually the number of municipalities that entered the empirical analysis is actually lower? It's because we had to clean this data set due to some like econometric consideration, but also some based on some institutional rationale. So first of all, in order to do this this analysis and study the causal effect, one of the conditions that needs to be met is that once a municipality enters the treatment, so it's treated, it remains treated. So in order to make sure this is true, we applied a number of conditions, and we kept only municipalities that do have at least 2 consecutive years of positive revenues with no permanent exit. And also we excluded those municipalities that have have multiple or discontinuous adoption blocks. So we don't know exactly why this happens, but of course, for to do a proper econometric analysis, this municipality cannot be maintained in our final data set and group of treated. We also excluded municipal unions. Why? Because revenues are pooled at the level of the union, but then we don't know exactly how these are distributed among the members of the unions, so which make them then difficult to infer that they have all the same probability then to allocate these revenues on different expenditure categories. And we also excluded municipalities that do have introduced actually the tourist tax, but they function under different legal provisions because they have special laws. This happens in autonomous regions or provinces. When it comes to control municipalities, so we included never treated touristic municipalities. So how? So of course, first of all, we included those municipalities that have 0 tax revenues throughout our window. We mirror this institutional exclusions that we applied for the group of treated. And then last but not least, the big elephant in the room, as I was saying, we don't have an official list of eligible municipalities. So we used as a proxy the categorization by ISTAT. So ISTAT provides a list of municipality where it distinguishes those that have a touristic vocation for those who have not. So we kept only those with the touristic vocation, so to have a closest to eligible and comparable counterfactual group. So what we do empirically is that we study the change in expenditure in treated and control group, comparing their expending behavior before and after adoption, in order to take into account for the staggered adoption. We use the Callaway-Santana heterogeneity robust estimator. To carry out this event study for identifying assumptions need to be met. The first one is the parallel trend assumption, as in standard diff and diff. According to this assumption, basically, what you expect is that in the absence of treatment, the treated and control groups would have followed a parallel path in terms of spending in culture and tourism. Empirically, how can you test for it? Is basically by calculating the IATT in the pre-treatment and post-treatment period. And what you expect to find to meet this assumption is to see very small, close to zero ATT in the pre-treatment period, but most importantly, you want these ATTs to be not significantly different from zero before the treatment takes place, which is actually the case in the sample under study, as will be very clearly shown when I show you the graph from a full event study in a moment. Second assumption, second condition is the common support assumption that basically requires that never treated and treated municipalities are sufficiently similar in order to be comparable. And this is in a way true by construction, considering the way in which we try to carefully build our treatment and especially control group. Irreversibility, so something that I anticipated when I was explaining how we built our treatment group. So once treated units stay treated, which again is true by design, because we kept only those which don't have permanent exit or multiple adoption blocks. And last but not least, the no anticipation assumption. So what this means is this: you don't want units to anticipate, let's say, the effect of the treatment. Concretely, what does it mean is that what could happen, so if there is anticipation, it means that in this specific case, for instance, municipalities, they, for instance, increase their spending in tourism and culture, so they change the spending behavior because they expect through this spending, for instance, to attract more tourists. And so then once the tax is in place and they know that they are going to adopt starting from a certain year, they expect them to obtain even more revenues thanks to this increase in tourism. So it's not, we are not in a position to verify empirically whether this is true or not, but we may plausibly assume that there is no anticipation. Why? On institutional grounds, because according to Italian legislation, municipalities cannot use debt to fund current spending. So we assume that this assumption is met. Before moving to the full event study and a causal analysis, we did a very simple but quite intuitive descriptive check in order to, in a way, to test the plausibility of our research question. So what we did is to select 3 cohorts, namely those where most of the municipalities adopted the tax, and then we calculated the average tax revenue per capita in these 3 cohorts. And then for the same cohorts, we calculated the average spending change, considering simultaneously together culture and tourism. In the year of the cohorts, in the cohorts year, so to 2012, relative to the previous year. So the change between 2012, 2011, 2018, 2017. And then we calculated the difference between column A and B's, between the tourist tax revenue and the spending change, that is clearly positive. And what we see is that this difference is strongly positive, always positive, although smaller in size in the last cohorts analyzed. So what this may mean, at least intuitively, is that the introduction of this tax brings revenue to may potentially cover this increase in spending, but possibly also other kind of expenditure. So it can go to the general municipal budget, or perhaps help municipality even reduce or address some financial some fiscal pressure. Here, so we're not going so we're going to focus only on two specific categories of spending, and we're going to specifically test whether there is an actual effect, and whether there is a specific causal effect, because of course this first test is simply descriptive. So let's move to results now. So first, where is the effect of the tourist introduction on tourism spending? So as we can very clearly see from this graph, first of all, as briefly said before, the parallel trend assumption is fully met. As we can see, the effect is basically zero and not significantly different from zero in the pre-treatment period. On the contrary, there is a positive, statistically significant and growing effect once the tax is introduced, with a positive spending change that corresponds to about 8-10 euros per capita per resident within 2 years of adoption, and an increase that reaches even 20 euros per resident by years 5 and 6, compared to the cities that have not introduced the tax, where our counterfactual group, of course, is represented by our group of never treated municipality. So the effect is significant, grows persistently, and then kind of stabilizes, which is actually consistent with revenue stabilization and institutional learning. You may wonder, and it would be a totally legitimate question, whether these results are actually driven by post-COVID recovery, and this does not seem to be the case, because we run the estimations. I'm not showing you the other graph in the interest of time, but we run the estimation over the pre-COVID period, and actually the same results approximately hold. Culture. Results for culture are quite striking, and because actually cultural spending rarely moves, but most importantly, the effect is not statistically distinguishable from zero at any horizon. We try to understand a bit more what lies behind these results, so we did run a couple of heterogeneity analysis, both for tourism and cultural spending. So first of all, we wanted to check whether the effect differs based on, let's say, the level of maturity of the destination. And we proxied with this level of maturity by considering the median spending on both culture and tourism before the treatment takes place. so in the pre-treatment period. So we calculated the median, and once we have this reference point, we divided our our group of treated in 4 different subgroups, based on whether their spending is above or below the median the median value. And what we find is that effects concentrate where tourism spending was already high, particularly when culture was not. So what this may mean is that possibly the tourist tax, instead of favoring a catching up effect for young or emerging destinations, it rather reinforces spending on those cities and destinations that were already quite active in terms of tourism spending, tourism valorization, which might possibly have a negative effect on residents' welfare, because this group of destinations are likely to include also overcrowded destinations. Secondly, we checked whether we observed differentiated effects across different typologies of destinations. And we can distinguish between the typologies of destination, again, reverting back to ISTAT categorization of destinations, and distinguishing between so-called cultural destinations from other types of destinations, including different types, for instance, rural destinations, sea destinations, or mountain destinations. Results may look a bit strange and counterintuitive at first sight, because as we can see from the graph, the effect is positive, significant, and growing, at least up to a certain point, for non-cultural destinations, and not for cultural destinations where the effect is not significant. But actually, it might make sense, at least a plausible explanation lies in the fact that perhaps cultural destinations count, this non-negative effect is explained by the fact that they count on inelastic demand from idiosyncratic heritage. So they might perhaps experience less pressure to upgrade their tourism services, while the opposite holds for non-cultural destinations, that they may have more pressure for more elastic demand to upgrade more their services, so to stay competitive compared to cultural destinations. Last but not least, we checked whether differentiated effect can be observed across different population groups. And we identified the different population groups, again on institutional grounds, because municipalities under 5,000 inhabitants correspond to a specific category of towns in Italy, so piccoli comuni, and then municipalities having more than 50,000 inhabitants, or more or less than this threshold, are actually subject to different electoral systems. What we observe is that the effect is basically not significant at the extremes, so for the extreme groups, while it is significant, and actually it's a quite clean effect, the cleanest of our heterogeneity analysis for cities in the middle group, for the intermediary cities in a way, so those between 5,000 and 15,000 inhabitants, where the effect is persistently significant and goes from basically a few euros per capita at the beginning of the period up to approximately 20 euros per capita at the end of the period. So how can we overall read this result? Of course, we don't know exactly what are the mechanisms behind. We cannot identify them directly, but we think that there are three possible mechanisms that explain what we observe. First, fiscal fungibility. So we have seen that tourist tax revenues are partially spent on tourism, or at least there is a significant effect on tourism spending, but it seems to be likely that there is even a surplus, as we observed through some descriptive checks, that possibly finance general municipal expenditure, echoing deviations from earmarking that was actually also already observed some time ago in some other papers, and in line with higher adoption probability under fiscal deficit observed by other authors studying the specific case actually of Italian municipalities. Another possible mechanisms is linked to destination competitiveness, as based on the results, municipalities indeed seem to prioritize maintenance or reinforcing of tourism destination competitiveness over maintaining or expanding cultural provision. Why is it so? Probably because mayors assume that cultural institutions already benefit from tourism through tickets and sponsors. But one important point to notice is that in Italy, this may actually not always be true, because most municipal museums are not outsourced. So the revenues actually flow back to the general municipal budget. And the third explanation actually may come from public choice theory, because this tourism spending growth might be also the results of hoteliers' lobbying pressure, especially considering that this effect seemed to be particularly significant for what we call as potentially mature destinations, where possibly the tourism sector is more organized. So in line with public choice theory, spending decisions may reflect political incentives and some interest and sectorial interest of specific groups, rather than a purely welfare maximizing allocation of resources. So to conclude, and I don't know if I'm going well in terms of timing, I think so, but Giorgio, you tell me. So this paper provides some what seems to be perhaps first causal evidence on how tourist tax revenues are actually spent in Italian municipalities, trying to bridge the tourism taxation and cultural economics literature, and showing that tourist tax has a positive effect on tourism spending, but there might be even more, probably part of it is even spent on some other category of municipal expenditure. And this might have some policy, some implications at the policy level. First of all, because what it means that introducing a tourist tax does not automatically generate more cultural spending. Certainly, this was not the case in Italian municipalities. And the tourist tax may actually primarily relieve pressure on municipal budget or increase tourism spending rather than cultural spending. And last but not least, which may be particularly interesting perhaps for the UK, to debate that is ongoing in the UK, if governments or cultural stakeholders want to support culture through the tourist tax, perhaps stronger earmarking or accountability mechanisms may be needed, because there is not such an automatic effect that can actually be naturally expected. Of course, as all work, this does have limitations. First of all, results do not measure, or the study does not take into account other possibly interesting and relevant categories of expenditure beyond tourism and culture, notably environment. Behaviors of municipality spending behaviors may potentially differ depending on whether on local governance settings, on whether, for instance, the management of local museums, for instance, it is outsourced or not, something that for the time being we didn't test. And of course, the results for the time being refer only to the Italian setting. At the same time, these are interesting, nice limitations that in a way open the avenue for future research. So we may potentially enlarge the study scope once other expenditure emissions are urbanized, re-estimate the model if we find good proxies for this museum outsourcing model, and eventually try to produce some comparative evidence across country to understand whether these results can be generalized or reflect a general pattern, general trends, or are specific to Italy. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I hope it was clear enough. This is, of course, ongoing work. These are primary findings, and we are hoping to develop a full paper out of it. And so we are ready to welcome questions. I think my co-author is here, by the way, and we will be delighted, especially to hear from you and receive constructive comments. Thank you so much.
Valentina, super interesting. I do have a lot of questions myself. Let me start by saying what I found really, really interesting in this. Normally as economists, we try to look for the empirical design and the effects. You clearly have those very interesting, the way you design the experiment, but at the same time, I found very interesting the introduction and the institutional design of the tax in Italy. So again, on one side, especially in crowded places, we think of the tax as a way to compensate locals. So what we define a Piguvian tax in a way, but at the same time, the tax in Italy is also a earmarked tax in principle, right? So it is what you would call a benefit tax. So it is a bit of both, but eventually what I get from your results is that it's neither. It ends up being neither. So I was really wondering, because you said at the beginning, much of the evidence at the moment on levies like this is on the decline you could have on tourist demand and the effects you could have. So if on one side you're collecting these revenues, but on the other side you're losing revenues from other sources, is it the case that municipalities might have a reduction in the overall budget, and this might actually require redistribution resources to collected through these taxes for other needs? I think that is one possible negative implication of a tax that is designed like this, especially in a context of fiscal contraction, where you have where you have reduction of transfer from the national government, and at the same time you're decentralizing the devolving taxes. Is that something that you think might be happening? It could be one of the mechanisms that you're saying could be driving some results.
It could be. So it's something that we did not perhaps specifically address for the time being, but something else that actually didn't develop so much, and this could be another explanation of what is happening as potentially a negative impact, is that there is actually, it seems to be, at least by speaking informally with some administrators, it seems that these tax revenues have a kind of replacement role. So what actually is happening, it seems to be happening in municipalities, is that this money actually goes to culture and cultural budgets. But it doesn't increase the budget, it simply replaces it. So this money is actually freed for other purposes. So that's why probably we observe no effect on cultural spending. But there is something else that I found out, and I found quite interesting, that this in a way does represent a cost for public administrators. Why? Because the rules, when you allocate money from taxes, the rules that apply are actually quite different from institutionally devoted budgets, because it cannot be allocated to multi-annual planning. Differently from institutional budget. So it means that what you had assured for multi-annual planning through institutional budget, now you lose it. So every year you have to decide how to spend this money. And this is an additional cost. It's a hidden cost.
But it might be a failure in the institutional design. I think it's linked to a question that has come in the chat by Alejandro. But if on one side, if it is a Piguvian tax and it goes on tourist spending, that is a lot more seasonal or yearly relevant. It's a year-to-year revenue to implementation. When instead, if you think of heritage, you need to have capital investment and multi-year investment. So there is a bit of a mismatch in the design. So I can see how you could be taking other funds that could be multi-year, move into culture, but not necessarily, and then reuse this tax for other purposes. That, I think that's the question from Alejandro. Are tourist taxes pro-cyclical? I think that is his question.
I don't know exactly. I mean, this I should check. I don't know. It's something probably I should check, but we didn't look into this. No. Do you have? Does the person who asked the question has any idea? I mean, is it comparing to other typologies of taxes? I don't know.
I don't know. I can ask him if he wants to answer to his own comment, and I can bring you the question. I think it's. I think it is difficult to understand, but it's related to the initial problem, right? Are they acting as a Pigouvian tax or not, right? Because if they act as Pigouvian tax, the objective is to reduce tourism, right? So they should be anti-cyclical.
Yeah. So but this is not something. Yeah, exactly.
So I have a question from Roland, is saying "Buongiorno e grazie, molto interessante." That's in Italian, so I'm relaying. I'm Roland from, this is going to be difficult, Guinet in North Wales. I apologize, Roland, if I butchered the name of where you're from. We are currently consulting on whether to introduce a visitor tax where any revenues would have to be ring-fenced for key areas as defined by legislation. I may have missed it, but how do you define tourist spend by municipalities?
Oh, well, very simply, in a way, in empirical terms, in the sense that actually this data come from commercial, administrative data that then is compiled by a commercial firm, and it's basically based on balance sheets of municipalities. And in Italy, municipalities do record the spending, what I was explaining, by mission. And one of this mission is dedicated to tourism. So here it goes, all the spending dedicated to tourism. Practically speaking, what does it mean? It's usually the way municipalities spend money on tourism is through personal costs of tourist offices, for instance, and mostly fairs, promotional events, and communication campaigns. So it's more or less these three typologies of spending.
This is quite an important question, right? It goes back to the cyclicality versus of the tax. So because if it is a Pigouvian tax, then it's supposed to restrict. But if it is a benefit tax, if, as you say in your introduction, in your motivation, it goes back into investing in amenities, for example, and cultural amenities, then it will increase. And what is interesting here is the effect you find on municipalities where there are typically, that if I understood correctly, they're not necessarily with tourist vocation, right? And they start introducing the tax as well. So that could be maybe the start of an investment, as you say.
Yeah, just one thing that I want to clarify, this is current spending, it's not investment. So because actually you have two typologies of expenditure, and what we are measuring here is outcome variable is only current, it's current expenditure, so that's why we avoid the word investment in all the paper and
because I was wondering a bit.
Current spending. No, it's not investment. No.
I did a question about whether it is tourist, because of course there was a question on tourist spending, but there can be also a question about cultural spending. What kind of cultural spending are we talking about? Is it libraries, museums? Especially in Italy, sometimes museums are partly owned by local authorities. Also, you have a split between national, regional, and municipal, which is also quite important. So it could be that overall spending in a place might go up or down depending on the other spenders, right? The national or the local. So if you are an authority in your heterogeneity investigation, maybe I will look at the extent to which the culture that is in spending is national, local, or regional. I have a question from Benjamin Kulka, and so thank you very much for this. Excellent. What is the evidence on the price elasticity of demand following the introduction of a tourist tax in Italy? Does it differ between different types of destinations? For example, the HH or LL groups of municipalities, could these influence cultural spending levels?
Sorry, I missed the very beginning of the question.
So the question is the price elasticity of demand following the introduction of tourist tax. So I think in the beginning of your presentation, you said that normally studies look at the elasticity of demand of tourists.
Yeah,
so what is the evidence in Italy, and does it different across groups of municipalities or types of municipalities? Could this influence cultural spending as well? I think it's related to what I was saying, right? If you have a decline in tourism or an increase in tourism, nonetheless, regardless of the tax, then there could be different groups affected differently, and then cultural spending could be affected differently. So depending on the initial effect of the tax, if I understand the question correctly.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I grasp the question, but I mean, the question is whether the effects are different depending on the demand elasticity, right? No, this is
so whether demand elasticity could be different across groups, I think. So
yes,
what is the overall evidence in Italy about the effect of the tax on tourism demand, and whether there is any evidence of heterogeneity across different types of municipalities?
Okay, so we didn't test for it because we are not studying this kind of elasticity, but it's something that in a way helped us interpret some of our results. So what I was actually saying when presenting the heterogeneity analysis by the different spending groups, the H low that the person is referring to, what we observe is that the effect is actually significant for those that before the treatment were already spending a certain amount of money, so higher than the median value. Sorry, so this was for the spending relative to the spending groups. But then I was referring to elasticity when comparing the two different typologies of destinations.
Okay.
So we also did an heterogeneity analysis comparing cultural destinations versus non-cultural destinations. And the effect is actually significant only for non-cultural destinations. And our interpretation is possibly what happens is that in cultural destination, the demand is quite inelastic due to the idiosyncratic heritage that they have. While in the other destination, probably the demand is more elastic, so they need to compensate in a way for this lack of idiosyncratic heritage by spending more on tourism, so and by making their tourism offer and their tourism setting more attractive and competitive. So this could be a justification for this significant effect on tourism spending. So this is where I introduced the notion of elasticity, but it's more part of our interpretation of results. We don't study this as we don't put it in the creation, let's say.
Yeah, so you don't investigate directly, but I think it answers. I think it does answer, if I understand correctly, the question what Ben is asking. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and so again, I'll just move towards the conclusion of the webinar. And what I would like to do first and foremost, Valentina, is to thank you so much for presenting this very stimulating research. If I understand correctly, it is not published yet.
No.
So we're looking forward to the publication.
Hopefully.
And please let us know when ready, and I'm sure that people online will want to hear more. And thank you also for engaging with our audience and with all the bunch of questions from me. To everyone who joined us online, we hope to see you back, of course, in our next seminar series that we will advertise soon and will take place in the new academic year from September. I'd like to thank again people who made all this possible: Simon, Emily, Tom, and Sheila for their technical support. So thank you again for being with us, and see you the next time.